And so we are live here with Tina Rasmussen on Soul Talk with the Meditation Center of Chicago. Tina, it's fantastic to have you on. How are you doing?
I'm good, Ryan. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm super excited for this talk. I even got a new microphone. I have to apologize for my previous guests for not giving them the same treatment. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too.
To this conversation. I found out about you probably a decade ago. You're the co-author of the book Practicing the Jhanas, traditional concentration meditation as presented by the Venerable Pa-Auk Sayadaw. He is a Burmese meditation master. So I had listened to an interview that you did on Buddhist Geeks, and you talked about going through the jhanas and the formless attainments and seeing subatomic particles and really experiencing reality in a way that I'd never heard anyone describe up to that point. So that's when I started to look into your work and see your teaching schedule and things of that nature. So you're like a unicorn.
Really?
And it's awesome that people are going to be, exactly. Because I've been in the Theravada world for so long and to so many different temples. There's so many different ways of practicing and there's so many different philosophies and techniques. And the ones that were always profound to me were the jhana practices, but there's so few people that have actually attained them and can speak with them authoritatively. So very happy to have you. And so are the monks and nuns that are listening to this call. So
well, it's a delight to be able to share some of this with an audience like that. So I really appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. So we can turn the clock back to when this path of meditation and spirituality really started for you. Now meditation is super popular. Everyone is into it. But back in the 70s, before then, it wasn't. It was pretty weird. I'm sure, at least
Yeah.
culturally in the West. So how did that all start for you? Did you kind of have a spiritual awareness even before you started a meditation practice? What was that all like?
Yeah, well, the way that it happened, my parents were into, they were very open-minded spiritually. And so I was raised with a lot of openness, even though we did go to we did go to unity churches, which in that day was, and I lived in the Midwest. So it was, kind of on the edge, but still mainstream enough that it was like normal. And then when I was 13, there was a family day at then the Methodist church that we were going to in the suburbs of Chicago, out in Wheeling. And there was a family day, and I just happened to wander into the sanctuary, and somebody was in there teaching meditation. And like my story now is that this person was, just come back from Asia somewhere, and it was in the 70s, and he was sharing what he learned. And my parents were off doing something else. I don't know where they were on the church grounds. And so I sat in there and I listened to what he was teaching, and I just started doing it at night. I mean, I had no education about Buddhism or anything like that, but I just started doing the practice, and it was really helpful. Being a teenager can be a little stressful. So it was extremely practical for me. That was how I got started. And, but I do think that, like, when I was a kid, my parents took me to a lot of different temples and churches. We went to the Baha'i temple in Chicago, and, we went to a Jewish synagogue and to other places, because they really, even though we were going to a Methodist church, they were wanting me to experience different traditions. So I do think that was very unusual. And it just gave me an open-minded view about these things.
So from having exposure to some of these various traditions through your parents, when for the
Oh, I just lost you a little bit. You frozen. I didn't hear what you just said.
Oh, got you. I asked when did you first encounter meditation as a form of a practice? When did you first sit down with that person who had returned from Asia?
That was when I was 13.
Wow. Yeah. So most of the people most of the people on the call didn't get into meditation until they're 17, 18. Some of us not until we were 25. So to start at 13 is that's just wild, especially to have done it back then. So
Yeah,
having
and it
this,
was just such a fluke because like my parents didn't even know I was doing it. I would do it before I went to sleep. And it was, they wouldn't have minded if I was doing it, but I just was doing it for myself. I didn't have all the teachings behind it. I just had it as a practice. That was it. And it wasn't until I got into my 20s that I really started. That was when in my mid to late 20s I really started um, wanting to learn more about traditions, and I just started devouring books from all different traditions from the library. And I experimented with different traditions, and then I did my first Buddhist retreat in my late 20s, mid to late 20s, and that was it. I was just hooked after doing a weekend retreat, and I just started doing longer and longer retreats and more retreats, and started reading too about different traditions. And then it started honing in on Buddhism. And once I started actually doing the practices deeply, I just loved them and wanted to just do more and more.
was there a kind of an initial mystical or religious experience that really solidified your interest in all this, or was it more of a just ongoing nourishment from the meditation?
Well, when I look back at the time, I actually went into the long retreats not wanting to read too much. I really wanted not to be like influenced by, and I didn't even know exactly that I was doing this, but there was some part of me that didn't want to know what to expect. So I actually didn't start reading about the practices until I was many years in and had done like month-long retreats. And really what I had was the talks the teachers were giving. Um, but what I realized now was that even on my first long retreat, I would hear the talks, and I would hear about how hard like the teachers would be saying how hard it was and how much people were struggling and this and that. And I'm thinking, gosh, I mean, not that I didn't have hindrances and defilements. I totally did, but I would just get into really some extremely blissful places that didn't seem like the norm. And I'd go into my interviews and say, I can be with the breath all day without going off. And, I'm having this I'm like outrageously blissful. What do I do? And my teachers would be like, enjoy yourself, you know? So I did start getting a sense that it wasn't common.
Mm.
And it was extremely healing. And at the end of every retreat, I'd see people around me when we broke silence, and they were like so relieved that like it was over, and I would just bawl my eyes out the whole time. I never wanted to break silence and come out of it because, I mean, I had a good life and things, but there was something so pristine and um, so such a depth of truth in that level of silence and depth within oneself that I didn't want it to end. And so that I could tell, at the time I didn't really know how to talk about it or how, that it was unusual until I started talking to other people. And I got invited to a senior students group when I was still in my 20s, because my teachers could kind of see what was happening. So yeah, there were absolutely tastes. There were tastes fairly early that are what made me start doing like a month-long retreat every year.
Right.
I went deep. I did my first 10-day, And it was hard. I remember, it's kind of funny now because I remember this was my first 10-day retreat. And, you know, I was in such great shape, like in my 20s. And I was so uncomfortable the whole time. I was so restless. And this poor guy next to me, I thought he was ancient. You know, he's probably about 50. He's probably younger than I am now, you know, and he just seemed so ancient to me. But he never moved. He was like the Buddha, you know, he's like my role model, that he could sit for this long without moving. And I was so restless. And of course, now I sit like he does, you know, but it's still, even with all that restlessness and with all the hindrances and defilements that I had, I would have enough taste that I could really go, I want to do this again. You know, how soon can I do this again? And so that was, it accelerated rapidly once I got into it. You know, my interest accelerated very rapidly. Yeah.
Right. This is a question that I get some from some people that listen to this show. Is there's some people seem to have difficulty with balancing their spiritual life and their worldly life. They feel like those things are incongruent at times, or they're just not on the same frequency. Did you deal with that growing up, or did you kind of feel like your career path was an extension of your spirituality? How did you navigate that?
Yeah, well, now it feels all very, very integrated, but that has really been a long process, because I worked, you know, still works a little in the business world. And I mean, I do humanistic work, so that's always been congruent. My values about what I was doing were always congruent. But, you know, 30 years ago, meditation is not what it is now. And I you know, would be gone, and I would be uncertain whether I could actually say where I was going and what I was doing. So I was a little bit in the closet for the first maybe five to 7 years. And then at some point I started really not, I just felt that it was, to be an authentic person, I had to be able to share this. So I would say where I was going, and gradually people got interested. And over time now, of course, these same companies are having meditation programs in their companies, you know, but when I started, it was not like that at all. It was a little risky to even share that. But at some point I just felt I had to be authentic. But then there was a whole period of like, how do I integrate these? I feel like I have two lives. And over the years, they've just gotten more and more to where, like, I feel like the work that I've done in the business world is about human potential. It's with leaders who are having a huge impact on the world, mostly in healthcare. And I'm doing a certain kind of human development and working with human potential with these leaders. And I'm doing a different kind with spiritual practitioners, but it's all about human potential. So it doesn't feel, it feels very seamless now. But that's been a long journey. So I think for all of us, we have to find what's appropriate in our environments. Some environments might be more accepting than others. But there's also being authentic. And you know, at some point, if your spiritual life is really core to who you are, it's hard to hide that completely and feel authentic. So I encourage the people I work with to try and find a way to feel integrated within themselves, and then to do what's appropriate externally for the situation that they're in.
Right. And to go back to the practice itself, I believe you had been practicing under Gil Fronsdal, and he was the first to refer you to look into the jhanas.
Actually, it was Guy Armstrong. Yeah, Guy was really, like, to my knowledge, the first person who really, at Spirit Rock at least, which is where I did most of my practice, and then I went to IMS for the 3-month retreat at one point, but living on the West Coast, you know. And Guy, I was doing the month-longs doing Vipassana for years. I didn't even know about the Samatha practice because nobody was talking about it or teaching it. And then at one point, Guy said, he had a small group of us who like secretly were doing the Samatha practice. And there was like this little island of Samatha people, and we were using metta. We were using the Brahma Viharas because that's how they had learned it. And we were in the sea of Vipassana people, and we'd be walking quickly, and all the Vipassana people would be walking really slowly, thinking, they're awful Vipassana practitioners. Look how fast they're walking, but we'd be going into the dining hall being like, oh, may they be safe. May they be healthy. We'd be doing metta. And anyway, there's a story that Guy tells about this period where one of the metta yogis, she went into the dining hall and she was so into her metta practice, but you're not quite as mindful. And she got her meal and she put it down and she realized she had to go get her water, and she got and came back, and then she sat down on her chair where she'd put her food. And so she sat in her food. So, you can imagine this little sea of us, metta yogis doing in the sea of Vipassana practitioners. But yeah, so it was Guy who really started bringing that in. And he was the one, when I did my year-long solo retreat and was reporting on what happened, he said, you really should study with Pa-Auk Sayadaw. And a good friend of mine, Robert Cusick, was the one who organized Pa-Auk's first retreat in the US. And that was how I was referred to Robert, and that was when I signed up for the first 2-month retreat that the Sayadaw did in the United States.
Wow. So do you have any idea how many month-long retreats you did before you did that year-long solo?
Yeah.
10, 15?
Something like
more?
that, probably. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
and
a
I
lot of
mostly,
silent time.
I did a lot of Vipassana, and then I started doing more of the Samatha as time went on, because that was being introduced, and there were even talks in the hall over the years. Then it became a lot more public, and there were a lot more people that started doing the Samatha, and it became a little bit more mainstream, and being talked about, but it was very controversial.
Yeah, I wanted you to touch on that. Why it seemed that going to these different retreats in different centers, staying at I spent some time at Panditarama in Myanmar, and I did my 10-day retreat in the Goenka tradition. And so I've been around the block in these circles, and in some of them, they're very not friendly towards the Samatha jhanas for whatever reason. Can you touch on that and why it's a thing?
Yeah. Well, initially, it was thought that in Asia, there's a different view than what we have in the U.S. And when I do my day-longs and things, I have a whole section on this just to make it clear. But it was thought, there were several reasons. One is it was thought that lay people couldn't do that practice, and maybe women couldn't do that practice either. So it was sort of reserved for the male monastics, which is kind of how things were then. But more so, it was thought that one should have stream entry first because of the supranormal powers that could be developed with the upper jhanas. So that one should have the responsibility of, have stream entry so that one wouldn't use those for harm. It doesn't mean a lot to us, as a lot of Westerners don't believe in those things. But, a lot of the Asian people that I've met, I've taught at some of the Burmese centers and such, and, it's seen differently, that it is, a real thing. And even like in India, Deepa Ma was studied by a university for doing these things. So, there was, and I get that, there was some thinking that that the practice should be reserved for those who could like handle it. And also there was the thought that not that many people could do it anyway, so why bother to teach it widely, you know? So, I mean, I understand where they were coming from. Also, within the Mahasi Sayadaw lineage, they really focus so much on the Satipatthana Sutta, which says that you don't need that. Although I've been told by Buddhist scholars and historians, of which I am not. I teach from experience, not from that, but I know people who are extremely learned, including Pa-Auk Sayadaw. And they say that 60 to 80% of the suttas, when the Buddha was asked how to practice, he pointed people to the Samatha and the Jhanas. You know, so to me, it's a little odd that you pull one sutta out and disregard the wide mass of suttas where the Buddha is talking about both samatha and vipassana, and just say, well, he didn't really mean it. You know, he just really meant this. You know, so I'm not sure, but in the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition, it was a lot more encouraged to just go for the vipassana, because you don't need the samatha. And if you do use it, it was taught, the people who taught it to me learned it in the Mahasi tradition, but it was then offered to people who had already had stream entry. So
Fantastic.
these were all reasons why it was thought to be unnecessary or not wise. And then, you know, Pa-Auk Sayadaw came along and had his own scholarship, which was extremely highly regarded around what the Buddha actually taught. And he started putting forth different understandings of what the Buddha actually was saying, looking at this large mass of suttas where the Buddha talked about the samatha, and saying we can't just disregard these. We need to look at what he actually said and what he actually practiced. I mean, that to me is the most compelling thing. You know, when I started teaching, I wanted to find out how the Buddha thought about this, you know, and he was doing this practice at the moment of his death. He could have done he knew he was going to die. He had, you know, seen this and predicted it before his death. And so he knew at the moment, you know, at the time he was dying, he could have done any practice he wanted to. And he did the samatha practice. Now that is compelling to me. He didn't do vipassana, he did samatha. So, you know, we can speculate as to why he did that, and we'll never really know for sure why he did it. But that is really compelling to me. You know, so those are some of the reasons why I think it wasn't done and was controversial, because a lot of teachers came back and they didn't even learn the samatha. So, you know, now if you've got senior teachers who's been teaching for 20 years who don't know a practice and who've invested all this time in teaching Vipassana, it's a little hard to go back and how do you integrate those? But it has happened, and I think now we're at a point where there's a lot more balance. At least that's my perception of it.
For the people that may not be familiar that are listening to this, could you define Samatha and Jhana?
Yeah, the Samatha practice, you know, different Theravadan traditions see it a little differently. So my teaching authorization is in the lineage of Pa-Auk Sayadaw of Burma. There's also the whole Mahasi lineage. There's the Goenka tradition, which I'm not as familiar with. And then there's the Thai forest tradition, which I do know something about how they see it. So just to give a context where I'm coming from. So the samatha is, the word samatha means both concentration and serenity. So it's important to remember that it doesn't just mean concentration. Some people call it the samadhi practice. And that is, the word samadhi just means concentration. I think there's a reason why it's called samatha, which is that the serenity is extremely important. We don't want to forget that part of it. So that's what the word samatha means. Basically, in the samatha practice, and there are many objects. The base object is the breath in this region between the upper lip and the nostril. It can be a region or a spot. But there's other objects, there's 40 objects. So it's not the only one in the samatha category, but it's a practice where we focus on one object to the exclusion of everything else, and we just bring our awareness back to that object over and over in order to unify the mind stream. And it can become very laser-like, which can cut through our normal perceptions of reality and also give a lot of power to that awareness when it's used for other practices like Vipassana. So that's what the Samatha practice is in a nutshell. It's a present moment practice. That's really important to remember. Just like Vipassana or any authentic practice, it is a present moment practice, and the breath is an easy object to bring us into the present moment. The jhanas are there are 3 levels of concentration: momentary, access, and absorption. And without going into all of those, unless you'd like me to.
Sure, please.
Okay, so momentary concentration is the first level. So any meditation we're doing, we start at momentary, where we're on the object and off, on and off, and that's momentary. And that's kind of like a lantern where the light of our consciousness is just shining in all directions. And then the next stage is access concentration, which has a very big range from about, staying with the object for 5 minutes substantially, all the way up to like half an hour, where we're really not going off of the object substantially. And that can be a very deep, it starts lighter where we're on and off, and then gets deeper and deeper to where the high levels of access concentration, we may not be thinking hardly at all. And it feels very, very different than our normal consciousness, and is extremely purifying. And in Vipassana, you can get up to access concentration. So because of having a momentary object that changes, any of the open monitoring styles of meditation, which we now know through neuroscience, there's the category of open monitoring, and then there's another category of focused attention. Any of the styles that do open monitoring can't get to absorption level. So they have other good things about them that Samatha doesn't have. So they're great practices, but just to distinguish. So then in Samatha or focused attention practices, because the object is stable, that's what makes it these two different, is the object, the type of object. So because we have a stable object, the awareness can become so unified that absorption into the object can happen. Our awareness becomes absorbed in the object. And what's really important about an absorption is that it is a non-dual state. And this is why I think the Buddha thought so highly of it, because the ego self goes dormant in a non-dual state. And there are other ways to experience non-dual states, but through concentration is one of them. And one of the good things about it is that once, if a person has access to absorption, it is repeatable. Whereas other ways of experiencing non-duality that are more momentary, like in Zen Shikantaza or in Rigpa, in the Dzogchen practice, they're momentary and they're not as predictable. So I think this is part of why the Buddha thought so highly of it, because when you cross that, the other thing is there's the threshold that has to be crossed where the ego goes dormant, and there's a lot that the psyche has to work through for that to be possible. Because basically we're having awareness without the presence of the ego self. And so that in itself is extremely purifying, and it's a preparation for awakening. It isn't awakening, but it's practice. It's giving our consciousness practice at being without the ego self, having that be dormant, which is amazing practice for awakening, where that happens in a way that uproots at some level. So And then there are different stages of jhanas that become more and more refined. And there's two categories of jhanas. There's the form jhanas, which are all using the breath or other objects, but you can use the breath, which is a physical phenomena. So these are also called the material jhanas. That's 1 through 4. And then there are what is called the formless or immaterial jhanas. And those are like a whole different category, which in Buddhism, these are understood to be actual realms of existence. So there's the physical realm, and then there's these 4 immaterial realms. And so they're just qualitatively different than the first 4.
And for these absorptions, the form jhanas and the formless realms, it seems that there's debate or there's contention over what is jhana in some of these communities. I wanted you to touch on that, because I hear one teacher saying that jhana is defined as this, and I hear you and Ajahn Brahm and Pa-Auk Sayadaw saying jhana is with an nimitta, and if it's not a nimitta, if there's no nimitta, it's not jhana. So can you address that? Because my point of view is that, well, the jhana with the nimitta is vastly more stable than one without one. So what's your take on this specific issue?
Yeah, and again, I will say that I have only practiced in the Pa-Auk lineage. I mean, I did do the Brahma Viharas, but I was told to go to Pa-Auk for really the full story. So I feel that my own teachers told me to go to him, and that's what I'm speaking from. I haven't practiced in, for example, the Ayakema tradition. So, and I will say that Lee Brasington and I once were both invited to an event, and he spoke in the morning and I spoke in the afternoon, and we each listened to each other, and it was quite lively. And we just agree to disagree, it's fine. But yes, so I'm teaching from what I've learned, and I did ask Pa-Auk Sayadaw that question, because I've been asked that question, without a nimitta, is it jhana? And he said no, it's not. He said no nimitta, no jhana. And I trust his scholarship. I mean, the man is extremely intelligent, highly respected. And when you go to him and you are sitting in front of him asking for, reporting and asking, this is someone who quotes the answer from the Pali Canon
by memory,
word for word. And then he does the same thing in English and never opens a book, and he knows everything. So, I trust his scholarship. So I'll just say that is my view of where I come from. And he doesn't just use the Visuddhimagga. He uses the suttas equally to the Visuddhimagga. So for those who say that he's a Visuddhimagga teacher, it's absolutely not true. If you read his book, you can see all the sutta references. So when I have, as you can imagine, there's a lot of crossover among students to teachers, and I get a lot of people who have studied in other traditions. I feel that, and I've also met a monk named Ajahn Chandako, who wrote an excellent article called The Honed and Heavy Acts, Samatha and Vipassana in Harmony, and he's from the Ajahn Chah lineage. And I felt that he and I had a very similar view of how it works, even though they feel it's more like 2 feet up the mountain. And in the Pa-Auk tradition, you do the samatha all the way from beginning to end, and then you do the vipassana. So there's that difference, but I feel that our understanding of what jhana is very similar, actually. And Ajahn Chah was an extremely attained jhana master, and very few people knew that because he couldn't talk about his attainments. But Ajahn Chandako went to all of the senior monastics who had studied, forest monastics who had studied directly with Ajahn Chah, and he wanted to find out what works in this tradition, and every single one who was really attained had jhana. And that's when he became convinced that, and they told him Ajahn Chah could go into jhana in one breath. This is how close he was to jhana. So people who think that isn't in the Thai forest tradition, it's just not true. So I feel that my understanding is very similar to Ajahn Brahm's, which, again, I haven't practiced in his tradition, but from, reading some of what he's written and hearing from people, I feel there's a lot of similarity there. The I Kema tradition, I'm going to say this, and I've had to say it to students when they come in and report their experience, and when I'm seeing them actually on retreats, I feel that what they're experiencing isn't jhana, it's access concentration. Because one of the key differences in the instructions is that when you start feeling piti, like in your hands, that's jhana. That is not, feeling piti is access concentration. That is not a non-dual state. What is the benefit? What's the point of even doing jhana if the non-dual state is the important part? It's not piti arising. So I feel that what he's teaching isn't jhana, it's access concentration. It's not invalid. It's a good thing. It's good for people to have access concentration, and purification of mind is definitely happening, but it's not jhana. It's access concentration. So, and the other thing is the lineage of that teaching. I got it from a monk who was unknown, who stumbled out of a forest and gave her these instructions. It wasn't anyone with scholarship. It wasn't anyone who was well known or was even known at all. It was a random monk who wandered out of a forest. So I find it hard to give that a lot of credibility. I mean, I'm not trying to be disparaging, but sure. When I hear it, what I hear being described is access concentration. It's really clear.
Yeah, because my question or concern with all this is, if even in deep access concentration there's no thought, how can people be describing jhana with thoughts?
Exactly.
Just because there's bliss and rapture and light arising, that all happens in access concentration.
That happens in Vipassana. When I used to go into my Vipassana retreats, I would go in one time. This is funny. One time when I was on one of my retreats, I would go in and I would describe the headlight doing Vipassana. And I had all the bliss. I had the jhana factors. I didn't know what any of these things were because nobody ever talked about any of that. I'd go in and basically I'd be told, your practice is good, keep doing that. And I was doing Vipassana. I wasn't even doing Samatha. So, I was in high level of access concentration. One time I went in and I was interviewing with Gil, and Lee Brasington was in the teacher training at the time, and he was sitting at the back of the room, like behind me. They have it where you can't, and Lee and I didn't know each other at all. He was just some teacher trainee and I was some retreatant. And I'm describing it. And he's, not supposed to be saying anything. And he says, she's describing jhana. And I'm like, what's jhana? I didn't even know what the word meant at the time. But, this just goes to show that you can have a high level of access concentration in Vipassana. So how is that different than Samatha? To me, if you're describing bliss and piti in your hands and stuff, I had all that doing Vipassana. What's different about jhana than that? Nothing. So that's, to me, there is a key distinction. And I've worked with a lot of people who get right up to the edge of jhana, and there's a whole thing that starts happening for almost everybody where the ego self starts getting that it's on the verge of going dormant, and that consciousness is going to not have an active ego self. And fear comes up. And that is a really important part of the practice of one's own spiritual unfoldment, because when non-duality arises, it is a practice for awakening. And it's important to go through all that. So, if that is part of why jhana is important. And some people will get up there and they can't they can't get over that threshold because there's just work that has to happen for that to be possible. Their concentration is good. That's not the issue. It's working through letting go. The letting go can't be made to happen, because the more you push, it's the ego self that's pushing. So it's like those toys you stick on your fingers, and the more you pull, like the tighter your finger gets stuck in it. You know, at that point, at the beginning of the samatha, you need the strong will and the, you have to really be a warrior. But as it goes on, there needs to be less and less of that, and there has to be a surrender and a deactivation of the ego self. And this is what awakening is. You know, so without that, jhana isn't that meaningful to me. You know, anyway, so I mean, to me, that's why I think I just don't see the distinction from vipassana, for one thing, because one can have piti and vipassana, and it's part of the teachings that vipassana can get you up to high access. So, you know, it doesn't really make sense just logically. And then secondly, why would a whole practice be designed just to have piti arise?
Sure.
It's the non-duality that's important.
What is the first jhana like? Because in some traditions, this first jhana is considered samadhi, right? You have attained samadhi when you've entered a jhana.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it is. I mean, in the Eightfold Path, right, concentration is considered jhana. You know, the Buddha, that's pretty clear, I think. So, yeah, it's, well, jhana, at first, before one has the masteries, jhana, you can't make it arise. Your concentration and your letting go, your surrender, the surrender of the me leading things has to be ripe, just like an avocado. You know, you can't put an avocado in the oven and make it ripen. You just have to let it. You can put it in a paper bag. So you can make it a little faster, and that's what we're doing with our practices, is we're creating optimal conditions, but it can't be made to happen through ego effort. There has to be a humility and a surrender to the Dharma and to the mystery, and a trust and a showing up. One has to show up 100% and let go 100%, which is really what awakening is being 100% present and 100% surrendered. So it's a great training. So when it happens, though, it's like one can feel it's sort of hovering there. And then at some point, the nimitta, you know, merges with the breath, and it's like the awareness is just pulled in. And
the nimitta is a light that actually appears in the mind's eye.
You talked about this earlier. Yeah, it's a light that's in the mind's eye. It has nothing to do with like our visual eyes. So sometimes you'll see people like on a lot of the retreats, the Pa-Auk retreats, you see people like with towels over their heads or eye masks on. And, you know, it's like, what are they doing? You know, they're trying to see the nimitta. So just to say, it has nothing to do with our physical eyes. It's all a byproduct of the unification of mind. So, and as the mind becomes more and more unified, the breath and this nimitta become one thing that's called the anapana nimitta. So it's merged. And if we're trying to see two objects, it's just we just stay with the breath. That's all we do the whole time, really. But people are tempted to look at the nimitta, and that'll just erode your concentration. So then you suffer, and you get to just stop playing with your nimitta, you know.
Then you suffer? You mean it dissipates? And
you suffer because the nimitta dissipates, and everyone sort of has to go through that in their own way. But it is pretty exciting because it's like people get that they can't make it happen, that there's actually something really mysterious going on here. And then at some point when the awareness, it's like your vibration gets more and more refined. And at some point, you know, you're coming up, coming up, coming up. And all of a sudden it's the same level of the first jhana, and your awareness can be pulled in. And surrendering is really the best. It's a non-doing, but there's a little bit of just really, there's a devotional quality to it, actually. And then the awarenesses of the object, which is the breath, you know, if you're doing anapanasati, and of jhana factors. And there's no thought, or there can be what Pa-Auk Sayadaw calls a slight imperfection of jhana, where, you know, occasionally a thought might come up, but it's extremely fleeting. That's like at first. And then and it's extremely, usually for most people, they can only tolerate it for a few seconds at first, and they pop out and go back into access concentration. That's when there's like, it's not like I'm in jhana. If that's the sense, then that's access concentration. There's just the awareness, and it's extremely, the purification that can be felt is much more intense than in access, even though it can be quite intense in access concentration in the higher. And then over time, if that continues, if one has the stability for that to deepen, it's like being at 14,000 feet altitude. You know, you start getting used to it. The first day you're like, I can't breathe, you know, and then as you get acclimated, it gets, you're normalizing, and that can be longer and longer. And then there's the jhana masteries as the next stage of the practice, where over time, some people can have it arise at will.
So for the jhana mastery, from what I remember from the book, you're able to make the intention to go into any absorption for a specific amount of time and exit on that right on the clock, correct?
Yeah.
So when you were undergoing this training with Pa-Auk Sayadaw and you went into the first jhana, and the mastery was to go into it for 4 hours, you come out at 3 hours and 59 minutes, you failed the test.
Well, yes, you do. I mean, this is why it can take 2 months just to do the first jhana for, you know, a lot of people. I mean, and he didn't make everybody do 4 hours. I think he just made me do it because he wanted to see if I could. You know, it was like, oh, I got a live one here. Let's see what she can do, you know? So, well, like, I don't make people do that, you know, because it just takes, you know, I don't teach 2-month retreats anyway. You need to have a long time. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about that point, as far as time for this level of purification of mind to arise. Lots of my friends have gone on these 10-day Vipassana retreats, or done short retreats, and they're like, I'm going to attain jhana at the end of this 10-day retreat. Mind you, it's a Vipassana retreat, right? But
good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of us have unrealistic expectations when it comes to these levels of refinement, you know? So for someone, you've taught so many of these retreats, why is it that so many people have difficulty from first sit to first jhana? Is it just that there's not really enough time for a lot of people on a 2-week retreat? Do they really need a 3 months of silence, 6 months of silence? We know in the Tibetan tradition, shamatha as a practice, there were people just using one object for months at a time before it would arise. I know Beyond Wallace has touched on that a bit, but what's your experience with that?
Yeah, well, I will say that I have had a few students come through from B.L. and Wallace's even long-term retreats, and I don't think people are getting enough guidance on those. So I don't think that is necessarily the best use of time, because you need a lot of guidance, you know. And so that would be one thing I would say, is if somebody really wants to do the samatha practice, get some guidance, because you could waste months or years of your life unnecessarily.
Wow. So when you were doing this with the Sayadaw, did you meet with him every day?
Yes. He insisted on that. And if it meant you stood there for 2 hours in the rain, you stood there for 2 hours in the rain waiting every day, which is what the women did, because there were a lot more of us. And when I became a nun, they made me go to the front of the line, but yeah, that's what you do. A lot of people don't like it, but that's his. And if you go in and he says, how long are you with the breath? And you say 5 minutes. He says, focus here. Next person. And you've waited for 2 hours to get that. So
Whoa.
yeah, it's a little different than
That
what
is
we're used
awesome.
to.
That is
And when he
awesome.
used
I
to do
love
that in
that.
Burma, people would come up on their knees after waiting for 3 hours. And he would do that. So, you know, we the conditions we have in the West are, you know, anyway, that's what he wants people to do. So yes, but I would suggest that people, the part of why he asked Stephen and I to start teaching was that he wanted people who could translate. It'd been so long since he had experienced that first sit to first jhana territory that he didn't have as much to offer there as he did once you had jhana. So like a lot of, you know, people have said that like he's great from base camp to the Mount Everest, but like you need somebody to get you up to base camp. And that's really what Stephen and I tried to fill in with our book. And that's what everybody needs. So our rate of helping people was higher than his.
That's
And
incredible.
that's part of why he asked us, because he could see that he needed somebody to flesh that territory out, you know. So just to say that there were a lot of people who did 3 or 4 months retreats with him that left in a really discouraged state, you know. And he's an amazing teacher. And if you have the opportunity to actually get to first jhana and then go on, has really a huge, I mean, he's incredible. So that would be the first thing, is don't do it. Don't think you can just do it on your own. Get some help, because people, once the concentration develops, whatever you focus on, it just expands. And people get into a lot of yogi mind, and it's intense yogi mind, and they don't know that they're in it doing
What do you mean
this.
by that? Yogi
Well,
mind.
once you get the laser-like awareness with the high access concentration, when the hindrances and defilements come up, all that laser-like awareness is going into them. And it's a lot, it will go into whatever you direct it at. And if you happen to get into some unsound thinking, it's going to get amplified with all that power. So, you know, you really need somebody to help you stay on track and not waste months, you know. So
Such good advice.
yeah, that's the first thing I would say is it makes a difference. The other thing I'll say is that not everyone has the capacity for jhana. And that's just an unfortunate reality. And one doesn't know until I feel that it takes at least 3 2-week retreats on, like in my experience with a lot of students over the past, 13, 15 years, is that to really know for sure, I mean, it might even take more than that, but I've had people who, first retreat, people are getting their sea legs, just understanding how to balance the energy and the concentration. There's a lot you learn about just getting more skillful, not just in samatha, but in any practice. And then second retreat, there's some additional skillfulness that may accelerate that. And I've had people on the third, fourth, even fifth retreat, that's when they attain first jhana. It takes a while to get their sea legs and to get enough momentum in the practice to be able to tell. And then there are other people, I taught a month-long a number of years ago, and it did make a difference for some people. For some people, it didn't make a difference. The thing is that even if one doesn't attain jhana, there's still a huge amount of benefit to one's practice of doing that purification of mind. So the idea that it's a waste if you don't attain jhana is completely false. It's completely false. So I mean, that's one of the unfortunate things about this practice. That's why I call it purification of mind practice. If one is doing Vipassana and doesn't attain stream entry, you don't give up after 2 retreats. I mean, can you imagine? Spirit Rock and IMS would have closed years ago if that was true.
Of course.
You know, none of the Mahasi centers would even be open if people felt that they would give it 2 or 3 retreats and then give up. So it's a real double standard that people have for the Samatha and the Vipassana. It's really, it's not what the Buddha intended, I don't think, if you read what he actually said. So, so that would be the first thing. But I think anybody, when I asked the Sayadaw about this, he said that he felt anybody who was really sincerely motivated to attain first jhana, he thought they could. So I don't, you know, I just pass that on. But I'd say every retreat, you know, if I look back, it's between 15 and 25% of people who attain first jhana.
Oh, okay.
So, you know, that gives you a sense of that. The cool thing is that for people who can, if they keep doing it, some of them can go beyond that. You know, I've had
the
people,
second, third, and fourth absorption.
yeah,
Correct.
I've had, you know, some people go up to 3rd or 4th jhana, even just on a 2-week retreat, once they really have their sea legs. But this is, we're talking a lot of retreats, you know, and it's extremely rare for anybody to get into the upper jhanas. As far as I know, there were only I mean, in all of Pa-Auk's, you know, decades and decades of teachings, he's only had a few people. He hasn't had that many. So I think, to be realistic, I think for most people, the upper jhanas aren't that realistic of a possibility. But first jhana, I mean, this is really what I believe, is that if a person even has first jhana, their shot at stream entry is going to be way higher. Because if you can take that concentration and direct it at Vipassana or at Dzogchen or whatever practice you're doing, it is a laser. It powers your practice in a way that it's rocket fuel, you know? So, and I think that even I've had so many long-term Vipassana practitioners come to my retreats, and even the ones who never attained jhana, their Vipassana practice is so much more robust, and they have a huge amount of insight. The Samatha practice is a wisdom practice. You can have insight into 2 of the 3 characteristics. So the idea that it is not a wisdom practice is totally false. I mean, in the Hindu tradition, the Samatha practice is the whole path. If you look at the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, that's what they're talking about. So, you know, I would really take exception, and I have a whole short talk on this when I do either day-longs or retreats on the Samatha practice as a wisdom practice, because we're getting insight into dukkha and into anatta.
Suffering and no self.
Yeah, suffering and no self at a very fundamental level. And Vipassana focuses more on anicca, on impermanence with the arising and passing. But I've had so many people experience, long-term people, monastics, who feel that when they do the Samatha practice, whether they attain jhana or not, their level of insight and being able to turn that power. Like at the end of my 2-week retreats, there's time to then investigate into one's own conditioning, and having that as a tool to gain self-understanding and wisdom is, you know, people have said they had more insight on a Samatha retreat than they ever did in their Vipassana retreats, just because of the powerful concentration. So, you know, I'd like to put out there that even if jhana doesn't arise, there's huge benefit in doing the practice.
Would you say that for your students that were pretty skilled in meditation, able to enter jhana on these short retreats, that if they had more time, let's say a 1 month or a 2 month, that the formless attainments would have been possible for those students
I don't know. I haven't actually done a retreat long enough. The people who've gotten up to third or fourth jhana, the month-long did help. So when one has access to first jhana, that time really makes a difference, because you can just, in 2 weeks, you can only do so much. You just don't have enough hours to get really past first jhana. It's really hard. Unless you're extremely experienced at it in 2 weeks. It's just not enough time, So then having the time does make a difference. Absolutely. I don't know. I haven't had anybody get past fourth jhana. And on Pa-Auk's retreats, Stephen and I, according to what we were told by Pa-Auk Sayadaw and one other monastic who taught with him a lot, we were the only ones who learned the detailed method. We're the only Westerners who he taught the detailed to. Everybody else learned the brief. So it just takes a lot of time, and we, what I'm teaching now is a modified version. It's not the full detailed, because people don't have time and they don't need it. I found a way to have people be able to go on where they have enough stability without learning all of the jhana masteries. So if they learn just 3 of the jhana masteries, it's enough. And I don't know. I don't know what would have been possible. And I don't know that I'll ever be able to teach a retreat of more than a month, because it's just too demanding for the teachers. I am going to be doing another teacher training that's probably going to start in January. And if I have a few teachers who have stamina that, can alternate, that could maybe be possible sometime. But I am working with people on solo retreats now. And especially with the pandemic, I have a lot of retreats in a box that I'm now offering, that people are having a lot of success with home retreats. So, we'll see. It's a big jump going up to the formless jhanas, because you can't use the breath anymore. So you have to change objects. And like when I did it, I did all of the kasinas in all 4 jhanas.
These are the different meditation objects: space, light.
Right. So changing all those up, doing them for 2 to 3 hours to get the mastery, and then going on. I was so concentrated by the time I tried to do the upper jhanas that, it just, I don't know what it would be like to try and have somebody do that without doing all of the kasinas first. And it just takes a lot of time. I was doing it when I was on that retreat. I could switch objects, and within a day or half a day, I could get the jhana mastery with that new object. And
that's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, now I think about it, I don't even know how that was possible. But it just takes a lot of time. So I don't know what it would be like to try and skip some of those and have somebody just use, you got to use Earth Kasina to go to the upper jhanas. So that's not the hardest one. It's like medium hard. So, if maybe somebody could get up to that. I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever have a chance to find out, but I would love it if somebody could do it.
That would be great, right?
I don't know how Pa-Auk Sayadaw felt.
Right. Well, let's segue into a lecture a lecture of yours that I listened to recently. It was called Dimensions of Non-Duality, and this was a talk that you gave to a bunch of spiritual teachers that have gone through awakening and have their own careers teaching. So it was fantastic to hear a very holistic perspective on non-duality. So this is something that you got a taste of during your first year-long retreat, where you were silent and just practicing alone, or was it even before this that you started to have a non-dual awareness and awakening?
Yeah, well, it started, with most people, I think, of having tastes you know, and having those glimpses that are so profound that they're life-changing, that it's like the most meaningful moment of one's life, that you just want to know that more deeply, and it brings a lot of people to the spiritual path. So I started having those and having more and more of them, and having those be longer, and that's when I decided to do my year-long solo retreat. And also had the jhanas during that year too. So yeah, that really, you know, the big shift happened during that year. And, you know, I knew about non-duality because I had also been studying with teachers like Adyashanti from, you know, the non-dual modern Neo-Advaita tradition, as well as Buddhist teachers and some Hindu teachers. But I didn't really have the level of understanding that I have now, because going through the formless realms with Pa-Auk Sayadaw, with his guidance, and with really getting confirmation of what was happening, and really spending huge amount of time, because I had to do all the upper jhanas in all the kasinas. So I didn't just do them once, I did them in every single kasina. So, you know, it was lots and lots of hours in the upper jhanas too. And then I started in the diamond approach after that, because I really could see that for me, the next step was integration and embodiment. And I felt that that path had some really good technologies for integration and embodiment, which has been helpful. But they have a map that gets into dimensions of non-duality called the boundless dimensions in that tradition, that I feel have some parallels with the formless realms in Buddhism. So that's what that talk was about. So it's only been after that I've been able to really understand these refinements in how non-duality can be experienced, that explains why, when you look at different traditions, if you look at Hinduism and Buddhism and Sufism and Christian mystics, like, are these people talking about the same thing or what? They sound so different. But if you really look at the dimensions of non-duality, that these are different dimensions, but they're still all non-duality, you can see that different traditions point at different dimensions, and that's why they sound different. But they're all talking about the same phenomena from a different, you know, it's like the blind men and the elephant. One's got the trunk, one's got the tail, but it's all an elephant. But if you heard their descriptions, you would say these people are talking about different, one's got a snake, one's got a, you know, tree trunk, you know. So that to me has been a development that's only really happened in the last few years, where I've really started understanding this more clearly, and also through my own experience that's happened since then, where I've had more deep dives into these different dimensions, and I've actually known what was happening. You know, before it was just non-duality, and it was like, you know, being in a new country for the first time, you know, you get off the train and you're like,
wow,
you know, right. You don't care about what town you're in. You're just in this country, you know. But then when you've been there several times, you want to actually know this town is different than this town, and this is mountains, and this is beach. And, you know, so that's really what's happened since then. It's been 15 years now, and my understanding and experience has become a lot more refined around what's going on there. Plus, I've gotten the teachings from the diamond approach that I feel has a good map of non-duality that's quite coherent.
So what's your definition of non-duality and awakening?
Yeah, well, this is it's interesting because, you know,
Because
when I've been
it seems a lot of people have a different definitions of this.
Exactly. Yeah, when I was interviewed, like on Conscious TV and Buddha at the Gas Pump, I asked them, what have you learned? And they both said, there's no agreement about what it is, you know?
Yep.
So I thought, oh, interesting. So just having said that, I don't feel my answer is the answer.
Sure.
It's what feels true for me. So awakening, well, there's non-duality, which is can happen without awakening. Just like I was saying, for me, there's taste, there's glimpses, and this is how it's taught in like Tibetan Buddhism. You try and have the glimpses, or in Zen or in Theravadan Buddhism, you have the glimpses, and then those can string together more, and there can be an event that maybe pushes one. There's a leap that's taken. But non-duality is when that sense of the subject and object, that I'm a separate me and all that I'm experiencing are separate objects, that collapses, the ego goes dormant, and there's a sense of non-separation. So the sense of body boundaries goes dormant or dissolves, and there's a sense of either unity with all things or emptiness of all things, or both. It depends what tradition. Like in Buddhism, emptiness is emphasized, and the Western traditions, unity is emphasized. But I feel that it's not really complete until one has both. So that's non-duality. And then awakening. So for most people, it's like a sandpapering down. You know, the ego self, I talk about the thinning of the me through spiritual practice, through these experiences, through digesting personality material, all of these things sandpaper down the ego self, and there's more and more contact with our deeper nature. So the trust, as the ego self goes down, the trust and the contact with our deeper nature increases, and the ego starts relaxing more. So there isn't that fear of like, what am I if I'm not this ego self? That starts diminishing because there's more actual experience with what's beyond the body and the personality. And then, you know, some people can sort of just go up to like 50%. Now they're at 51%, and they're over the halfway mark. That happens for some people where it's very gradual. But I think for most people, there's some gradual sandpapering, and then there might be a somewhat bigger experience that's maybe gives them 10% more, and then there's more sandpapering. But I feel that there's that 51% rule where at some point our ground identity shifts over to the ground of being from the ego self. And like, it's more noticeable when there's a big experience where this happens, and now maybe somebody was at 35%, now they're at 65%. Mm-hmm. You know, that's really noticeable. But even after that, like in Theravada Buddhism, there's 4 stages of awakening. So I think this has been a big misnomer that if somebody has an awakening that gets them past the 51%, where their identity is shifted and won't ever go back to where it was. Even if they're acting from the ego and they have a temporary identification, they don't really believe it. That to me is stream entry is, you know, considered the first stage in Buddhism. And it's where we don't go back. It's a permanent shift of identity.
And would you say that requires cessation?
You know, I'm not sure about that. And, you know, I talked to other teachers, and there's a lot of ways that awakening happens. I mean, to me, cessation, which I would define as basically absorption of the personality into the ground of being. So it's like phenomenologically, it feels a lot like a jhana, but instead of being absorbed into a jhana and having conscious awareness, which is what happens in jhana, even the upper jhanas, one always has conscious awareness. When cessation happens, it feels like death is imminent because the ego self isn't dormant. It actually gets absorbed into the ground of being, and one loses consciousness. So there is no consciousness of that happening, and there is no sense of whether or not it will end or not. Wow. When it happens. So there has to be a complete letting go of the ego self in a way that is a surrender and a relaxation, that one can't make that happen. The ego self has to be surrendered and relaxed enough for that to arise.
And in that moment before that event horizon into vanishing completely into the ground, is there a visceral experience that happens in the body? Is there physiological markers that people feel when, because I'm recalling a sutta reference where I think the description was that the deathless element was being perceived in the body.
That's interesting. Yeah, well, I think it's a great description. I love that the Buddha just said what it wasn't, so people couldn't get concepts about it. But yeah, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience, which is that it was clear that death was imminent. And yet there was such a beauty and a draw, and it was so compelling to not turn away, that it's like the end of what has been sought. So there's both the fear of the death that feels imminent and the magnificence of the end of what has been sought.
And in the stages of insight, there's path fruition and then the review stage. So after this cessation occurs, there's some psychological transformations or changes that occur, correct?
Yeah, it's only after, like for me, when it happened, it was only after where consciousness was regained, and I was in a chair, and like I just roughly estimated it had been about 10 minutes. And, I was like slumped over and my neck really hurt a lot. So, there is a way that I've heard, I think maybe you and I talked about this once. I've heard of people having this happen while they were driving. I'm kind of glad that this wasn't my experience, but the people who had it happen while driving just kept driving, and all of a sudden they were conscious and didn't know how they'd gotten from X to Y. So there are stories of that. Yeah. But it's a complete surrender, really. And so that you asked about the physiology at the back end, there's the physiology of realizing what's happened and, coming out of that. And then there's just, I'm sure there are a lot of different descriptions for people, because like for some people, through the traditional like Mahasi style Vipassana, it's a lot based on the way that the letting go is encouraged is through seeing a certain level of emptiness and meaninglessness in the and the suffering that is coming from the arising and passing that's uncontrollable. So that is what allows for the letting go, is the sense there's no control over these phenomena. And so there's a letting go that comes, it's a little bit more on the aversive side. So I don't know what that, like a dry insight, I don't know, I can't speak to what that would feel like after, because it's coming from a little bit of an aversive orientation is creating the letting go. I mean, these are different pathways up to the top of the mountain, so the one's not better than another, but it might be experienced differently. If it's like the jhana practice and the samatha tends to be more juicy, it tends to be more on the full side of the equation. And I tend to lean more there. So for me, it was more of like, it was almost more Sufi-esque, like a return to the beloved.
Wow.
So it was more on the full side it was more on the unity than the empty side. And I do practice a lot of Dzogchen also. So that feels more, because it's coming from a view of reality that this is Nibbana, that samsara and Nibbana are the one thing. It's our view that makes it one or the other. There isn't really a need to get off the wheel. So it's that is the view, even though I teach a lot of Theravadan practices. My view is actually more Tibetan. It's more the Vajrayana, the Mahayana Vajrayana view, which is actually true of a lot of the Western Theravadan teachers. So
when it comes to the four-path model in stream entry, once returner, non-returner, arahat, is this cessation the same experience as being the same vanishing, the same unborn, irrespective of the paths, or is it just the fetters falling away that is what actually defines a person as more enlightened?
yeah, well, that's a really good question. It's my belief that the actual, just like the formless realms, aren't, it doesn't matter what tradition you're in or what path you're in. There isn't a set of formless realms if you're in the Ayakema tradition and a different set of formless realms if you're in the Pa-Auk tradition. There's formless realms. They're empirical realms, and so it's my view that cessation is the same, that there is one absolute, what I would call the absolute, which is the very most fundamental dimension of non-duality. It is the dark. It's really what I think Theravadan Buddhism is going after the most. It's the black, the complete void, the non-being, the mystery from which all form emanates. And that is the most fundamental thing we can know. That we are that at our most fundamental, and that is what the consciousness, the individual consciousness that is affixed to a body, gets absorbed back into temporarily. And I don't think that depends on the tradition, but I do think there are ways that awakening can happen. Like, not all traditions have cessation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I'm not sure about that. I actually, my own perception, the more people I meet, the more teachings I see, the more individuals I see who I feel are awakened,
right,
who maybe haven't had the cessation experience, and teachers who haven't had it, who I feel are very realized. So I don't know how to explain that other than to say there may be other ways that it happens other than cessation. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, in Theravadan Buddhism, it's very clear that that's required. So I don't know.
So we're starting to get questions thrown at
Okay.
us. Anyone else want to ask questions? You put them in the YouTube comment section or on Facebook. This is from Paul Fears. What is your experience with non-physical phenomena, spirits, devas, subtle energy, non-physical realms, aliens? Do you believe these things exist?
I would say that I'm very open to that possibility. There have been times in traditional Buddhism, there are different realms of existence,
right,
that are considered very, very real, that I've seen into at different times, and I've experienced different kinds of beings. At one point in my own growth, like when I did my year-long solo retreat, I got a very clear message to not explore that anymore. And I have been involved in communities of people who are very skilled at perceiving other realms, psychics and such. And there are ways that at times people can become very distracted with those things, and it actually takes them off of their awakening path, because it's very exciting. And so I was told, I have no judgment if people are doing that. It's their path, and they need to, there can be a lot of benefit from having contact with higher beings. But it's, so I would say that I'm open to that possibility, and I feel that I have experienced that, but it's not something I seek at all anymore, because I was given it was a clear knowing when I did my year-long solo retreat that I needed to stop that. So I did.
I got a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned a meditator and a nun named Deepa Ma, and I think in other talks you mentioned that this lady was able to sit in meditation for a day without moving, an entire 24
I
hours.
think she was able to do more
Longer,
than a
right?
day. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just didn't talk about it very openly. So what is it about meditators that can do that? That can sit for 2 days without moving compared to the average person who enters jhana? Is it just that they just have 30,000 hours under their belt? What do you think?
Well, Deepa Ma, a lot of people feel that she was one of the most attained practitioners of our time. So, I mean, talk about a unicorn.
Right.
I'm like a goat compared to her. So yeah, so she was a real unicorn, and
That makes me a toad. If you're if you're a goat, I'm a toad. Jeez.
I'm the goat that gets put in the stall next to the unicorn if she's the unicorn.
Right.
So yeah, so she was just phenomenal, and she also was a renunciate in a lot of ways. Even though she was a householder, she lived a very poor life and very, very humble, and very willing to renounce at the level of a lot of the monastic tradition. And so she was, I think, used to suffering in a way for her practice and just in life that a lot of us maybe don't have as a capacity. Like, if it hurt, so what? But I think she also just, I mean, she's the one that Manindra and Mahasi Sayadaw, of all the people they could have picked to test out the whether or not the paranormal, supranormal powers were real, whether or not what was described in the Visuddhimagga worked or not. And they want to do a test, so they picked Deepa Ma. That's who they picked. Of everyone they knew around the world, they picked her to do the experiment, and she did it, and she had scientists studying her, and she bilocated, and she predicted what a politician was going to say in the speech 2 weeks later and wrote it all down, and then they recorded the speech. And I mean, she did all these things, and scientists recorded them. So you think about the level. She did have to work up to that. Like, she just couldn't do it every day. She had to have the jhanas going and have them sustained. But I mean, she just was a practitioner at a level that I think there are extremely few humans who will ever be at that level.
Another question.
She's a huge inspiration to a huge number of people. So, yeah.
Wonderful.
If you haven't read her book, I highly recommend it to anybody. Yeah.
What's the title of her book?
It used to be called Knee Deep in Grace, and gosh, I can't remember the new title. But if you go into Amazon and put Deepa Ma, D-I-P-A space M-A, it'll probably come up.
Fantastic. Next question. What's your view on sexual abstinence and some of the tantric philosophy of the use of sexual energy in path?
Yeah. Well, I think both have their place. I really do. I mean, there was a period I undertook where I was like in my 30s, and I decided to intentionally be celibate for a couple of years because I wanted to both I wanted to work through that craving for relationship and find some peace with that, social and human and biological urge that we have. And also the energies from that can be used for spiritual practice. That's what monastics do. And it is a lot of energy that can be utilized if one is using it, internally and bringing it up, up like the central channel and using it for spiritual practice. It can be a certain kind of, power for the practice. So that can be extremely useful. And if someone feels drawn to that, I would encourage them to follow that pull. And learn more about it. The Taoists have a lot of technologies around that are fairly advanced. So if you read books, Taoist books, there's some very, detailed things that they suggest about that. Different for men and women also.
Right.
And then there's the tantric sexuality practices that are done with a partner. And, that can also be a very legitimate spiritual practice where it's done as a spiritual practice and also utilizing those energies, but in a different way with someone. And that does different things because there's that vulnerability of being known that doesn't happen when one is, by oneself. So there's some different ways that can, it's not surprising that comes from the Tibetan tradition where they're a lot more about eye-open meditation and that transition from on the cushion and off the cushion being really emphasized quite a lot in the practices. So I think both of those are valid.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you about that, your experience going into Dzogchen practices, and now that's one of the modalities that you teach. And from what I've heard, a lot of your students have had quite a bit of success with realizing Rigpa and the Dzogchen path. How did you move into that, and what is that like now? Because I think I heard you mentioning that that's one of the main practices you do today.
Yeah. One of it's Spirit Rock and IMS, and mostly I've studied in Buddhism at Spirit Rock and then with Pa-Auk Sayadaw, of course. They would have Tibetan teachers come there, and a lot of the teachers were studying with Tibetan teachers, in particular Tsoknyi and Mingyur Rinpoches. And so I did that. I did it as part of, it was really kind of the umbrella practice for my year-long solo retreat was Dzogchen, even though I would do deep dives into the Samatha or doing Vipassana. That was sort of the umbrella for the year, and or doing Brahma Viharas I did, and yoga and Qigong and such. But I, just did the practice for so long and have done it so much. And when I hit my 10-year point of teaching, a lot of teachers will take a sabbatical, which I did at year 10. And I really want to think about, do I keep teaching? Is there a demand for it? Do people want it? And what would inspire me? And I realized I wanted to teach something that was closer to my own practice, which doesn't just include the Samatha practice. It includes Vipassana and Brahma Viharas and Dzogchen, as well as other things, So that's when the Luminous Mind Retreat was born, where people on the 2-week retreat, and the other thing I'll say is that I love the Tibetan teachings and the retreats. One thing about those retreats, though, is there's about 6 hours of teaching a day and not that much meditation. So right. I would find, I would love them, but I would find I had to do the retreat and then I had to do another retreat to practice, and then I didn't have any guidance while I was doing that, so it wasn't optimal. So I thought I wanted to give retreats that are what I would have wanted, which is a retreat that really is about meditation, where you're practicing, where it's bare bones teaching, and where they get a lot of guidance, which often you don't get one-on-one guidance that much on Tibetan retreats, which I think is really essential, because people waste a lot of time just going in circles. And so that's when the 2-week retreat now has a track for Samatha only, people who want to see how far they can get with the Samatha purely. Everyone does Samatha for a week, which is another thing, that if you're going to do Dzogchen, you need some strong concentration. You got to have it. And the Tibetans really believe in it too. They speak, really emphasize shamatha in that tradition. So we do a week of that, and then people decide if they want to stay with the Samatha or go on to the Dzogchen. And then there's a day or two with Vipassana, and then there's the Rigpa, the pointing out, which I will say I've been asked, like, have I been authorized by a Tibetan teacher? And the answer is no. So I don't make any pretense to say I have been. But when Pa-Auk authorized me, he authorized me to teach up to the level of my own attainments. So everything I teach is something I've attained. I don't teach anything I haven't attained myself. And so that's why I feel that I can do that, because I love the practice, and I basically use the neuroscience to break it down to its simplest form so that people can learn it in 2 weeks. And between the Samatha, between the jhanas and the Rigpa realization, it's about half the people on the retreats are having some taste of non-duality. So, and then at the end of the retreat, so the Dzogchen people get those instructions. The Samatha people don't hear them because you don't want to be distracted. And then at the end, people can switch over. And sometimes, sometimes somebody who's been doing Samatha all the way to the end can switch over and realize Rigpa, or vice versa with the jhanas. And so to me, it's like the best of everything, because people have the option for both. And for those who want to learn the Dzogchen, they have 2 weeks of actual sitting with support every 2 days.
Amazing.
Amazing. Yeah, so I just love doing it because I get to keep teaching the Samatha, which there aren't that many places to learn it, but I also get to teach what is closer to my own practice now, which is the Dzogchen.
That's so incredible, because I'll share a story really quick. When I met Namkhai Norbu, Chogyal Namkhai Norbu, in 2012, and then again in 2013, and there's meditation, and it's for 10 minutes when you're doing guru yoga at the end of the lecture, right?
Exactly.
And I'm not sure if I ever told you this story, actually, but so the first one in 2012, I read about the pointing out instructions, and I had this idea in my head that I'm going to get enlightened when he does the guru yoga. And so at the end of the lecture, he's explaining nature of mind, and mind being like a mirror, and all this, and it made no sense. None of it made sense. Completely over my head. And then he does the guru yoga and gives the Ati yoga transmission and the pointing out instructions, and nothing happened. So afterwards, I go up to him, right? Because you get some time with him at the end. And I asked him a question, or I paid my respect to him, and I asked him, Rinpoche, you did the transmission, but nothing happened. Did I miss something? He started laughing. And he's like, just keep practicing. And so a year later, I meet him again, which is so unusual that he would come to Pasadena, of all places.
Wow.
2 years consecutively. And this one was a little different. He gave different transmissions and lung, like empowerments for certain practices. Yeah. And at the end of that retreat, I got more time with him. I got to ask him a question again. And I asked him, Rinpoche, how do we realize nature of mind, Rigpa? And he just looked at me and he said, how do you feel? I said, present. And he said, now relax. And I said, that's it? And he's like, yeah. He just nodded. That's it. So that made no sense at the time, but you're a Dzogchen practitioner, so you totally get it. Can you explain what Rigpa is, what essential nature, what nature of mind is, what that means?
Yeah. Well, Rigpa, the way I understand it, it is nature of mind is another way that it's talked about. It is our fundamental awareness, and it is the awareness that's aware right now for everybody seeing this, right? As you're sitting there, it's there. You don't have to do anything to get it. It is the awareness that's knowing all mental formations, all perception and phenomena that are arising in awareness. It's the awareness that is knowing that, and that is the ground. And in the dimensions of non-duality, what I'll say is that where I place it, because Rigpa is bright, it's clear, it's not black, it's one level up, in my view, from the absolute, where it's like in the it equates to neither perception nor non-perception, which is a non-conceptual, but clear and bright and very open level of awareness that is much easier to maintain with eyes open and functioning in the world than the absolute is, because the absolute just sucks everything into it. It's like a big, black hole sort of thing in a way. It sucks all form and thought and everything else into it. So there's a stillness that is extremely profound in the absolute, but Rigpa to me is one level up from that. And it is still the ground awareness, but it's one that is easier to function from. And that is why I think it's so cool that the Tibetan teachings are focused on a dimension of non-duality that is still extremely empty and profound, but that is possible to function from, which allows for us to go through life. If there's enough stability, one can function and do normal things and have that be possible, to have continuity there. So that's, to me, what Rigpa is that ground awareness that is non-conceptual, direct knowing of experience without identification.
Boom. That is an awesome, wow, great definition of that. Another question. This will tie into a question that I have, actually. How much does removing ego material and psychological issues play in awakening, stream entry, etc.? And the question I have attached to that is, how does a person go from having glimpses, as you said, to it being their ordinary ground consciousness permanently? There's no reversion.
That's the what do they say, $52 question or whatever it was. That's the big question, really. That's it. Yeah. Psychological work is extremely important. I just can't emphasize that enough. And I think it's been de-emphasized. And what we have in this era? What we have in this era is psychology. That is what we've got that all the other generations didn't have. And I believe if the Buddha was here now, he'd be using all that. Right. So yes, working the psychological material is extremely important. And therapy, sometimes people think spiritual practice can do it all. And there are certain things that are better treated, I think, with therapy, with psychological interventions. And the two can be very much go hand in hand and support each other. So why not take advantage of what we have in this era? So, and the other thing is, like, the way I like to work with people is that on the cushion, you will see your patterns. You're either doing transformation of your patterning. So you're basically stuck, seeing hindrances and defilements and self-images and defense mechanisms and all that, or you're having contact with the transcendent. So you're either doing transformation or transcendence. When you're sitting, that's what you're doing. So when you're seeing the patterning, why not just be curious and not judge oneself about it and be like, wow, I go into planning a lot. Wonder what that's about. How is that protecting me? What is kind of ego defense? Is that from fear? Is that from greed? Is that from I'm bored and I'm going to do planning while I'm sitting here? And then off the cushion, we start working with that in our life. Like, how am I trying to control my life through this? Or, and we start doing the off the cushion work just as actively as the on the cushion. And things can be liberated in our off the cushion work too. And so they become one seamless flow that support each other. So I feel that's essential, just as essential after awakening as before. Look at the scandals. That's why they're happening, as people have awakening, and it feels so permanent. And, if it's awakening, it is permanent, but that doesn't mean all the psychological material's gone. So yeah, it's really important. And then the second part was, how does one go from glimpses to stability? Well, the psychological material is a big, big part of that.
Wow.
Thinning of the me, like the Theravadan 4-stage model, this is my addition onto that model. But like, what if you would say the first stage, you say you're over the 51% mark, you're 51% grounded being and 49% ego. That's still a lot of ego left, So, and if you look even at the Theravada model, you just got a reduction there. You don't have a wiping out of the defilements. And then the next stage, say you're up to 75%, and next stage you're up to 90%. And it isn't until the very end that you're at 100%. And so few people will ever get to that,
Right.
So to me, to just assume that you're going to be working that stuff the rest of your life and get good at it. So that is part of what makes the continuity possible, is there's less ego material that we're identifying with. We're seeing through it, and we're getting some freedom and digesting the things that were too hard to digest at the time they happen, and that's why defense is formed. So that's one thing. The other thing, frankly, is concentration. Without concentration, I don't care what practice you're doing, it will wobble and you'll be lost in thought and identified again without that faculty being strong in our consciousness. And that's why the samatha, no matter where one is, it's valuable, because you won't have continuity without a concentrated mind stream. I don't think just logically, it doesn't make sense unless all your egoic material is gone, which, doesn't seem that likely. So between the thinning of the me and then developing the concentration, also how you arrange your life. If you're too busy, there isn't enough mind share to keep part of the awareness on the ground.
Right.
So, it's a combination of a lot of things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Two final questions. I know I kept you longer here than I promised.
Oh, that's okay.
You're a unicorn, so I had to. So, question is, this is in my temple, the Dhammakaya tradition. This is a topic that a lot of people are talking about: physical health. Third of the monks and monastics in Thailand, there was a study showed that they had diabetes, big problem.
Aww.
Can't teach Dharma if you're gonna, have issues like that. It's very, very unfortunate. What's your take on the importance of physical health and meditation practice? Asanas, yoga, even I've heard you mention Tumo. How did you work with those, particularly on your year-long retreat and afterwards?
Yeah, I think physical health is really important. I know in traditional Buddhism, there's sort of a disparagement of the body. Mm-hmm. But the way I see it, if we're going to have a human experience, got to have a body. No other way to be in the physical realm. So, if we're going to have one, we should respect it the way everything should be respected. And not be, I don't believe that aversion towards the body is I don't believe aversion towards anything is actually helpful. So physical health, I think, is very important. I've always done some combination of yoga, walking, I do hiking. I'm pretty active physically, but as a spiritual practice, yoga, walking, and qigong. And
wow.
Yeah, I think that
Great.
Those practices, whatever a person is drawn to do those regularly, if not do something physical daily, especially if you're sitting a lot, and I have done the 8 precept route. And I think if someone feels inspired to it and your body can work with that, then it's great. But it does encourage a lot of, it's not so good. I think this may be part of the diabetes situation, is sort of the feast and famine. It's not really as good for the body or like in my case, I have low blood sugar. So it would affect my mental, my cognitive capacity. And so like when I would sit with Pa-Auk, even though we were on 8 precepts, we did have soy milk. And,
right.
you know, he felt it was important to keep your strength up. So, you know, I would encourage people to have a healthy body, to eat healthfully, and to take good care of your body, because it's necessary for a human experience in the physical realm.
Fantastic. And the last question, and I think this will tie back into the year-long retreat you did. In that lecture on dimensions of non-duality, you mentioned that you were basically practicing 24/7, because Rigpa, you had awareness even while you were dreaming and sleeping. And in the Tibetan tradition, we call that dream yoga. How did that actually manifest? Did you find that you would just awareness was stable, so you just transitioned into the dream state and would continue meditating while dreaming? How did that actually look like for you?
Yeah, well, when I did the year long, I intentionally wanted to do dream yoga. So I had been on and off over the years doing dream journaling, which I also did during that year because it gave me some insights into my unconscious that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Again, going the personality material, dream work is a great tool for bringing material to the conscious mind that's buried. I had tried learning lucid dreaming, you know, and so that was intentional. I intentionally, you know, I had all this time, so I thought, why not try it, you know? And so some of it was intentional, and then there's periods where, like, I will have this on and off where I will find that there's what I would call a Rigpa lock-in. That just becomes stable without doing anything. It just locks in for some period of, you know, time where consciousness continues through sleep without doing anything. So that to me is different than doing a dream yoga or lucid dreaming where one is taking steps. But I think they're both excellent. And, you know, like my Tibetan teachers, this may be what you're referring to, also said that if you can realize Rigpa in your dreams 3 times, then you will probably be able to do that at death. So, I mean, 3 times like in a row, not 3 times total. But if you can do dream yoga to that level, it's a great training for the bardos. So there is some view of that.
And by clear light in the dream state, do you mean that when the dreamscape dissipates and there's just a clear light of awareness?
Well, the way I interpreted realizing Rigpa during the dream state would be that in the dream state, when one is lucid dreaming, in the dream, one is realizing Rigpa intentionally, the way one would like in the Dzogchen practice.
Got it.
And that if one in the dream could do that, could be lucid and realize Rigpa like that, was good training for being able to maintain consciousness in the transition of death.
Got it.
With that state transition, you know. So yeah, so that's how it was during the year. I mean, you know, I've worked full time in a corporate environment and all kinds of things since then, so I can't say that that's been constant the whole time. But
I love how honest you are about that. That's amazing. That's amazing.
What's that?
I love how honest you were about that.
Yeah. But it does happen. I mean, it's happened a few months ago where it was just constant.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm walking back my claim. I want a final question.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask it, and then, you know, we'll end the show. And I think this is an important point, because when students are in the presence of you or in the presence of another teacher that has entered these states and has these realizations and really lives them, there's a visceral effect on the student. It actually, the student awakens can awaken further being in the presence of a teacher. What is responsible for that? Do you have a theory on why that is? Why, for example, people will go to a retreat with Adyashanti and they've gone here and there and nothing happened, but for some reason in front of Adyashanti, they just wake up. Why does this happen? You know, students with you, I'm sure they get this, they do your coaching and there's really a lot of progress, but it seems that a lot of it isn't from words.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's mirror neurons.
Oh.
So, I mean, we're starting to understand biologically some of that mirror neurons we have resonance in our neurons with others. So that could be a scientific explanation, but I think you've seen my little diagram here. So like, okay, so this isn't a trick question. Like, what do you see there? Okay.
I see a piece of paper covering your hand.
And you see 4 separate fingers.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah, I see 4 separate fingers.
There, let me do that. 4 separate fingers. Okay, this is how we normally experience each individual. We're all separate individuals. This is what happens with awakening is, yes, from this level, from this view, there's a truth. There are 4 separate. From this view, there's a hand, and that's a lot more fundamental. And so what's happening is that when there's that contact, there's actually the non-separation can be experienced. And so that is what's actually happening, is that the sense of where the 2 individual consciousnesses aren't actually separate in reality, and in a different dimension of reality, that gets activated. And so it's really just activating the other person's awareness of that. And there's mirror neurons, so that would be the scientific. But I mean, there's, they call this transmission in the past, but that makes it seem like, a teacher is like zapping the student with ray beams or something. And I think it's a little bit more like I'm trying to show the mechanics of it. That there is actually a place, if you think about it as dimensions, like sometimes it feels like a wormhole to me, that there's a wormhole that goes down through the dimensions of non-duality to the absolute. And at the level of the absolute, which is the deepest level, there is just the mystery, really. I mean, it's that black source from which everything emanates. And if that can be, and at that level, there is no separation at all.
Right.
And so that is what's getting activated. The awareness of that is getting activated, in both people.
Beautiful. And comments, genius explanation of awakening. Tina, thank you very much. This was a wonderful talk. I'm going to be posting your website in the comment section, but could you tell everyone where to find you? And
Sure. Yeah. My website is www.luminousmindsangha.com, and all my events, and I do one-on-one sessions with people, which a lot of teachers don't, but I love doing it. And other things, my retreats in a box, my mentoring program, all that's on there. So thank you so much, Ryan. I enjoyed our conversation.
I know. It was so much fun. Thank you, Tina. And thank you everyone for watching. See everyone
everyone
next Sunday. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.